everyone. Welcome back to the Harbor YouTube channel. My name is Dawn and I'm here with Dottie, and Easter has come and gone. And so last night, Dottie shared with us some thoughts on the crucifixion and the resurrection, particularly in the Gospel of Mark, which is our first gospel recording, but also kind of a very odd ending. So Dottie, why don't you tell us more about it?
Yeah, thanks, Dawn. So we looked at the last chapter, the last verses in Mark 16, 1 through 8, and in the original Mark account. And it ends really bizarrely with the women that went to the tomb not seeing Jesus's body. And instead they're greeted by a man in a white robe who tells them that Jesus is alive, Jesus is gone. And their response is they are in so much horror and terror that they're absolutely silent. And that is how the gospel ends. It's like end scene, that's it. And it's just this really bizarre gospel. And so when we talked about it, we really wanted to focus on one, the crucifixion is cruel, right? And the crucifixion, trauma is a very popular word right now, but the crucifixion is a story of capital T trauma. Jesus's body is brutally handled. He is tortured. He does not have a fair trial. And it is a state-sanctioned execution. And on the cross, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And Kelly Brown Douglas talks about how this is not only physical trauma, but it's also spiritual trauma. So we talked about, before we even get to the resurrection story and the story of the women, we have to talk about how severe the crucifixion is. And at Harbor, we talk a lot about James sorry. We talk a lot about James Cone's theology, especially his theology of the cross, and how he compares it to the cross is similar to lynching, and the lynching of Black Americans. It's a horrible, horrible image. So that was part one, is we have to just recognize that when the women are going to the tomb, they are in the aftermath of violence. They are in the ruins of trauma, and they are still in absolute horror of what they've witnessed. So when they get this good message, it's almost like they're not ready for it. And we talked about a lot of different interpretations of this passage. A lot of people wonder why did Mark end this way? Was the ending lost? Was he trying to center the cross? Was he critiquing the women's lack of faith? What might have been the reasoning of the ending? And rather than kind of debating the different interpretations, the focus was really to look at their silence and how these women's silence honored what words sometimes don't capture when we experience so much violence. So we talked a lot about the silence, and then we also talked about what does it mean to hope in the resurrection amongst the deep pains of the past and in the midst of suffering. There is so much more to that conversation. It's so hard to even recap it. There was a lot there, but I'll stop there and we can kind of chat more.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, Dottie. It was and necessarily it was a heavy night, and you certainly also and I think we all just have so much violence at the front of our minds, state-sanctioned violence, like from Gaza, from different wars, from things that we've experienced in our own countries and our own communities. And so it really, yeah, it hit in a lot of different ways. And but I think was really helpful, for at least for like folks I got to talk with, I think it was helpful for us
Mm.
to talk about and to consider, um and to, again, to be reminded of James Cone's understanding of the cross and the lynching tree and those images. um we had we had some really great discussion about it, and one of the things we started with is just how different it was for some of us think about the crucifixion within our current context of, where of capital punishment and of, of war crimes and of genocide, and giving Jesus that, um inviting Jesus into that space where Jesus is, but being able to see Jesus in those moments of violence, and maybe even finding hope, in Jesus' presence there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, what were some of the things you've been
Mm.
thinking about more?
Yeah, I've been really emotional reflecting on this story and thinking about it, specifically with Palestinians that are suffering. And part of the piece that's felt really hard to metabolize is what does hope mean when people are dying,
Mhm.
um, and will not see the resurrection, right? Like in or new life. So that's been a really gut-wrenching tension I think I've held with this story this Easter is it's really hard to understand hope, at least for me. But that is part of the discipline of spirituality, and hope is a spiritual discipline that we are actively choosing. Um, Not saying that we're inflicting that on people suffering, like just hold on to hope, right? Like, but that Jesus was in so much solidarity with the oppressed to the point of death by the empire. So yeah, our discussion group did not get to hope. We talked a lot about the crucifixion. We talked a lot about Mark's ending and a little bit about the silence and finishing it with silence. It was interesting. We kind of took a deep dive into Jesus's words on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And we had some hungry brains that were just ready to go into the ancient languages of that and how it was a nod to Psalm 22, and Psalm 22 doesn't end in despair. It was really, really interesting. Larry was in our group, and I'm sure, would happily be a resource to anyone that wants to talk more about some of the ancient languages. But he brought up how the end of Mark that's added at a later time references serpents. And serpents aren't actually snakes, but they're always a symbol of doubt. And so we kind of wrestled with when doubt pops up and some of those analogies, and kind of this interesting way of incorporating doubt into the whole story. Um, yeah, so there was so much going on in our group. We just were really in the text. We were going in a deep dive. We were sharing our different ideas about why Mark ended, and then we were going into some ancient Hebrew, ancient Aramaic, ancient Greek, and trying to understand this text specifically, but also the texts that surround it and some of the texts in the Hebrew Bible as well that might have been a part of this. So yeah, I think a lot of us, though, were kind of taking a deep breath and just struck by how to have integrity when thinking about the cross. And that is left a lot of us, some of us in tears, and just really trying to honor how cruel the events were then, and so many events are today. So
When we were running on time, we had to make some choices, and I asked people, like, do you want to talk about silence, do you want to talk about hope? And everyone was like, please, let's talk about resurrection and hope. And so we had a little bit, and one of the kind of truths that we wrestled with is that hope, it can be hard to thinking about the women, and as you were saying, like, just impossible to grasp the resurrection, because there, I mean, hope is also very scary and very disruptive because it requires a complete shift in the status quo. So I think, and I know, like, when I think of times when I've been depressed or just very or scared, and just hope doesn't, it feels like a waste of energy, you know? Like, why, like, what's the point? Um and so I really appreciate, um and yeah, we said, but it's the only way we move forward. It's the only way that we, like, you don't, you can't change something if you don't have hope that things will be better, right? And so, um that's not a how to hope, that's a, yeah, hope is hard and necessary and hard.
Yeah. I recently a research project on meaning and hope that I did, I think in 2021, has been resurfacing and is out for publication right now. And so my colleagues and I have been doing edits and like discussing it more. And it was interesting. I looked back on some of the literature around hope, and hope is essential for well-being and flourishing, but also hope activates us to change and to have pro-social behavior. So hope is essential for us to engage with other people in a more kind, loving, justice-centered way. So it's just, it's of course, like the story of Jesus does end in hope. And psychologically speaking, like hope is really essential for not just our own well-being and flourishing, but so that we can be agents of justice in the world. And so, yeah, there's just a lot around hope. And this year in 2024, I've spoken on it a couple times, and I continue to be perplexed by what hope is and how to cultivate it, because I do think it is very very challenging and confusing at times, but something for all of us to lean into.
Well, Dottie, thank you so much for that, for your message last night, and for the really thought-provoking questions. We continue to meet on Thursdays. We'll be starting a new series coming up, and so you can watch our socials for more information. Great to see you, Dottie. We'll see you later.
Thanks, Dawn.